Going through the Ramsey program, I know what they coach. I understand why they take the approach that they do, but I don't actually agree with it to a point.
What is it? What is the approach? You stop making progress and you start making wins.
Yes.
The hardest part of winning the finance game is the patience.
Information presented on this program is believed to be factual and up to date, but we do not guarantee its accuracy, and it should not be regarded as complete analysis of the subjects discussed. Discussions and answers to questions do not involve the rendering of personalized investment advice, but are limited to the dissemination of general information. A professional advisor should be consulted before implementing any of the options presented. Encompass More Asset Management LLC is a registered investment advisor with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and only transacts business in states where it is properly registered or is excluded or exempted from registration requirements.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Tullux podcast. I'm your host, Branden DuCharme. In the studio today, I am joined by the financial coach from our practice here. And we want to give you a quick, light episode here. Everyone's busy for the summer. But one of the questions that we get a lot is, especially from a younger generation, so maybe like kids of current clients that we start engaging with and helping out, we'll oftentimes have questions about their debt, right? And hey, like when should I start investing versus paying off my debt is a common question, right? That we get. What debt should I pay first? Should I, do this balance transfer thing? Like there's a lot of questions around debt, managing that, credit scores, all this kind of stuff. So I thought what a great opportunity to bring financial coach on a little bit more your wheelhouse, Marcus, to kind of work with some of those finer details and pick your brain on it. So, like I said, let's tackle the first one, right? So, common question amongst younger people, especially that are professionals, second generation clients, this sort of thing. Like, hey, when should I start investing versus like paying off debt, right? Yeah. What are your thoughts?
There's going to be multiple schools of thought on this. And mathematically, there may be a best solution. And it does come down to the individual, but it also comes down to the type of debt that we're addressing. That's actually probably the most important question. Because if you're talking, hey, I have $100,000 in student loans or I have $500 credit card, those are going to be kind of two different answers because the time frame to address them is drastically different. But for the most part, you want to isolate the debt that is the most impactful to you first, right? And for the majority of people, we can get into the student loan conversation and, that could be a conversation in and of itself, but let's just say that it's like credit card debt. So the basic consumer debt that plagues most people. Most of the time, the conversation is going to start around that first, regardless of the interest rate, because in part of that reason is you can address the highest interest rate first in some schools of thought, but for the most part, you want to take which debt is the lowest amount as a total, and there's some psychological benefit to addressing that first. Okay. So if you want to think of it like a checklist, like hey, let's say I have 10 types of debt. But I have one that's 500, next one's like 2,500, and it progressively gets bigger as you go down the list.
It goes all the way down to the mortgage. Mortgage is the biggest, or student loans, and it's like then you have your car, and smaller than that is maybe a major credit card, and you get all the way down to whatever the Kohl's card, the Kohl's department store credit card of $500, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And the reason that the address the smallest volume amount of debt works really well is because once you check that off and you say, okay, cool, I don't have that anymore.
Sure.
Now it's like, I don't have 10 things, I have 9 things. And then you can address, hey, well, okay, cool. Well, that money was already going towards X debt. You can kind of roll it into the next one. Sure. And that can accelerate that payoff. And that type of methodology is actually pretty effective. For it. That's what the Dave Ramsey program calls the snowball effect. You just take you order it by size, address the smallest one first, pay the minimums on every other one. Everything that's left over goes towards that smallest debt, get that paid off, and then everything you were paying that smallest now goes to the next smallest, which is now the smallest because you've paid that one off, right? Right. And it accelerates over time. And I was actually just talking with a client recently who was using a different method. I don't even know what they call it. It might have been called like the maybe the waterfall approach or avalanche approach, whatever they call it. I don't know. But basically, it was like
avalanche should be where you start with the smallest interest rate first, or sorry, the largest interest rate first.
And that's kind of what they were addressing. They were like throwing a big lump sum at that, and then kind of tailoring them down above the minimums.
Yeah.
And that works mathematically. It works really well.
Mathematically, it works better.
Yeah,
right.
It does. And sometimes if you're a type of person that having to address 10 things at once doesn't bother you psychologically at all, great, go for it. The minimum is a great way to go as far as money out of pocket to pay those debts off. But I could tell that the stress of dealing with all those types of debt was wearing on her. So I kind of said, well, let's take a look at this approach if you haven't looked at it yet. And she hadn't. And I said, well, how would it feel for you just from a motivation standpoint if, in a month you can pay off one of these, and then in 2 months you pay off the second one, and then in 3 months after that. So in 6 months you have 3 of these gone, not to worry about. You could just see this person light up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you stop making, you stop making progress and you start making wins.
Yes.
Right. Finance is a game where stuff can, move really quick in your face, but stuff can just take time. Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the hardest part of winning the finance game is the patience, right?
Yes.
The patience side. Right.
Very much.
So, sometimes we think of things like 6 months is forever away, or 2 years is a really long time from now. And, it's really not in finance terms, right? But we live in a world of instant gratification. And so I think what you're calling out behaviorally, if I'm understanding you correct, is, hey, you can stop having this thing where you're always saying like, okay, well, I'm making progress, right? And so in 15 more months and 14 more months and 12 more months, and you can start saying, woohoo, I got a win. Okay, I got one done, right? Check it off. So you stop making the progress, you start making the wins.
Yes.
And that's what keeps somebody going and motivated to continue to, pay stuff off, right? I mean, if you're paying debt off to some degree, no matter what, you're tightening the belt strap, so to speak, right? So at a certain point, like, you have to make sure you're staying motivated so that you continue to keep the belt straps tight, right?
Yeah. And I think, that's, it's really important to address those type of wins too, because, we've the attention span of people, I guess, over time, if they've measured, is kind of getting shorter.
Yeah, we all have the attention span of a goldfish now.
Right,
yeah, I get
essentially. It. And because we have digital access to everything that can always be in our face constantly, and that's an asset, and you could potentially call it a liability as well, because
pros and cons.
Yeah. So, if you're constantly, hey, what's my balance today? What's my balance today? What's my balance? And you're looking at this, and then if it has like an accrued interest to the day, you can say, oh man, I got this more. And it could just drive you kind of nuts.
Yeah.
And, part of paying off debt is, one, becoming a little bit more disciplined with your cash flow. But also it's like, you still want to be able to enjoy life in that process, which is totally possible, right? People have a tendency to tie their life to certain things. And I've met people that identify with how much debt they have, both to the positive and to the negative, right? And, if you're one of these people where you're really stressed out by that, sometimes just changing the outcome to a win-based outcome by just checking off like, hey, this is no longer applicable to me. This is no longer applicable to me. In the end, you may save a few bucks, but it may be marginal based on the amount of like stress it saves you over that time frame. Yeah.
Well, that's the behavioral side of finance, right? Where you can start a plan and you can say, okay, well, the optimal plan from a calculation perspective is to do this, the avalanche method, attack the highest interest rate first, right? However, if you get discouraged halfway through, put the whole thing on pause for 3 or 4 months, all of a sudden it's actually more expensive, right?
Yes.
Or, could be. So that's the behavioral side. Like, you have to acknowledge the behavioral side of finance essentially at all times, right? Or it's going to wreck you. So your methodology of paying off debts, you prefer the snowball method, right? Attack the smallest balances first. And so we talked about an example earlier where, hey, you have, the department store credit card, you've got, your phone that's financed at T-Mobile, you've got your major, credit card, your Costco card, you've got your, a small car loan, a large car loan, a student loan payment, and a mortgage, right? And like, at what point do you start investing money, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's really important because there are a lot of different thoughts on this. And this is where, like, as going through the Ramsey program, I know what they coach. I understand why they take the approach that they do, but I don't actually agree with it to a point.
What is it? What is the approach?
So in their mind is you don't do any investing at all, even into like a retirement account, until all your debt's paid off.
Okay.
So that's where I start to disagree, because if you have an employer-sponsored 401k, there's some tax benefit there to you as well, right? So, and if they're doing a match, it's hard to beat 100% match, right?
Yeah, right. Like if you put in $3,000 into your 401k and your employer puts in $3,000 on your behalf, like your rate of return on your $3,000 is immediately 100% rate of return. You've doubled your money. So even if the credit card is 30% a year, right? That $3,000 you could have, paid off a credit card at 30% a year would have in effect saved you, easy round numbers here, $1,000. So instead, like you're out an extra $1,000 of interest, but you're up an extra $3,000 of contribution. So you have a net positive of $2,000, and that's not accounting for any additional returns that then the markets make for you, right? So it's a great starting point. I think that's a really great call out, like that people have to remember and understand is when you get that employer match and that's an opportunity set for you, like if it's all sixes, but you get a long-term tax benefit, you probably still want to take that. But most people get that employer match, and you want to take advantage of that, right? If you have the capacity to attack both, right? So, hey, put enough money in the 401k to get the match, take the free money, and then still chunk away at the credit cards, right? Aggressively. I always like, one of the things that you guys hear me say around the office all the time, right? Is like, hey, don't fall victim to the or, right? Embrace the genius of and.
Yeah.
So it's not invest money in the 401k or pay off a credit card. It's invest money, in the 401k, get that match, and still pay off the credit card, right? You got to figure out in your cash flow, in your personal economy, how to make that happen. But if you can tackle both, then do it, right? Certainly will slow down the payment of, the reduction in debt, but your net worth will grow faster. And that's really what matters, is the net at the bottom of the, at the bottom of the page. What if they don't have an employer match?
Well, I still think that it is still best to have some sort of tax-deferred account that you're leveraging against your income. So if there's no employer match, but there is a 401k, or if you're self-employed and you have a SEP or solo 401k or whatever, right? So put your, my personal recommendation for people is 10% of your gross goes into your retirement. And that's at any age. If you can afford to do more, right? Yeah. If the maximum contribution is more than 10% and you can afford it, go ahead, go for it, right? And, because again, debt is a time-based game, debt payoff, but also like building net worth is time-based. So if you're delaying your, retirement savings, whatever the goal for that is, if you have to delay that by 10 years, you're 10 years behind in starting from zero. The first 10 years are probably the most important 10 years of the investing. So my thing is in tax-deferred accounts, take advantage of it, because you're not only building your base, you're also dollar for dollar, it costs you less to invest because it's pre-taxed, right?
Well, I want to call something out really quick, is that oftentimes what we work with, or, what you might work with, is somebody that's a pretty high income earner, right? And so pre-tax might be more appropriate. I think the terminology that we probably should use is actually just tax advantage, right? Yeah. And the reason why is if you're, if you're dealing with a small amount of, it might be like, I'm trying to think how to articulate this here. If you're dealing with an amount of debt, it might feel large to you. but if it's small in absolute terms relative to tax brackets, right?
Yes.
You still might want to do Roth, right? Especially if you have, a bright future ahead of you that you think your earnings potential is going to grow over time, right? You still would want to probably really consider Roth contributions,
Sure.
right?
Yep, that's totally fair.
So not tax deferred, but tax advantage still, right? Because it gets that tax-free growth. So just wanted to maybe clarify that for somebody like, hey, there is a time to do tax deferred, and there's a time to do Roth, and those things can change from year to year depending on how intricate somebody's planning is, what their life circumstances are. But it's about getting the tax advantages associated with, either one of those options, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the big things is I don't like to see people get so focused on something that is just mathematically attainable, like paying off debt, and forego something that also is mathematically attainable, as in building a good nest egg later in life for retirement.
Yeah.
Right? They are both possible. You can do both at the same time. I would say that from the investing side, any investments beyond a retirement, I would pause for a while until there's a substantial amount where it makes more sense to invest versus pay off the debt. Because now we're talking, this is basically like your take-home pay. And, when you do run the math there, when we talk from a net worth perspective, when you pay off the debt and then you start investing, the net worth grows at a substantially faster rate than it does if you're doing both at the same time with that take-home money. Because that was my experience. I tracked it for 3 years, and then when I paid off debt, it went up really fast comparatively.
So you just have a lot more cash flow to put towards the investments. I think there's a gray area, right? So I think a lot of people, if you say, hey, you do the 401k, or, hey, put some money in, a Roth IRA, don't lose sight of that, make sure you're paying off the credit cards. Otherwise, and that makes sense to them, right? People go, yeah, okay, credit card, 18% interest, it's probably higher than the expected return on the investments in the short term. So, let's do that. But what about when you get to so you knock out all the credit cards, and now what you end up with is a car, you have a car loan, right? The car loan is the next thing, right? So somewhere, that revolving consumer debt, but a car loan is your smallest thing now. How do you tend to think about that with people?
So this is where I start to deviate a little bit from the David Ramsey program. If people really buy into that type of program, I'll go with that with them, because that's what they're comfortable with, which means that they're more likely to go with it, right? This is where I really do take a look at the interest rate, because some people get great interest rate on cars, right? So me as an example, I worked for an auto parts manufacturer for a number of years, and I got beneficial treatment for that because of the nature of my work. So I qualified for a 1.9% interest rate on a brand new car.
Yeah.
There was no way I was paying that off early.
Yeah,
right.
If somebody let me borrow $1 billion tomorrow for 1.9% fix, I'd absolutely take it.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is where I start looking at that, because that's the first piece of it, and it's not the only piece. Then the other piece comes with, well, how much of that car payment is eating up your take-home pay, so your cash flow? What percentage of this are you out of balance with that, right? So my general rule of thumb that I advise people on, when I coach them, is hey, if your interest rate on your car is less than 3%, you're fortunate enough to have that. Just let it ride.
Less common now.
Yeah, not less common now, but but if you're, you start getting into the 5, 6, 7, 8%, then it's well, okay, and let's take a look at this, right?
Let me give a quick call out on that just popped in my head too, because sometimes I do still see where it's a pretty low rate. So somebody will be oh, I got 2% or I got 3% on the car loan, or hey, I even got 0% interest on my car loan. This is a quick friendly reminder to everyone: no free lunches in finance, right? So if somebody's going to sell you a car and they're going to finance it on your, for you, right, with a 0% interest rate, money is never free.
No, it's not.
Okay, there's always a cost to money, and so what they've done is they hide the cost somewhere.
Yep.
You pay more for the car. And they give you a 0% rate.
Yeah.
They make a larger margin that essentially covers their internal cost to carry that note at 0% interest, right?
Yep.
You still pay a loan. It's tougher to figure out what your effective interest rate is that way. And so a lot of people will fall victim to that. The difficulty around that is just realize that so if the price of the car, lowers, you still owe the full principal balance, right? If you sign up for an 8% interest rate and interest rates go to 4%, right? You can refinance the loan. Okay. So oftentimes it's actually better to pay a lower amount for the car in absolute terms and sign up for a little bit higher of an interest rate because you lock in optionality if the interest rate environment changes.
Yes, that's very true.
So just quick side note on that. Yeah,
that's very true. And the other part that I tell people with this is like, look, we're going out of debt. Instead of, if you had the behavior of, hey, look, we're going to buy a car every 3 years, which a lot of people do, and they start rolling the loan into the new car, it basically turns into like, well, how about this? You just run this car until it basically dies or it's not worth it to fix it again.
Sure.
And then, essentially like whatever that would be is you either buy, if it does die, like you buy a cheaper car, or you are already creating like a savings account to buy the car.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say I would say the number one thing that I see hold people back, right? If you evaluate people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s on, what has held them back the most financially over the course of their lifetime, a common theme often is that they drive, they're constantly financed in vehicles.
Yeah.
And so, the financing of the vehicle actually isn't the problem. It's that it's more vehicle than what they can truly afford, right? So, again, like you had mentioned, like, okay, you could get a 2% interest rate, right? So like if you could afford a $30,000 car and you've got the assets to pay it, but they just give you a 2% loan, well, like that's just effective use of leverage. Nothing wrong with that, right?
Exactly.
If you have to finance a car because your assets are $1,000, so you have to finance a $30,000 car, and now you're stuck to that payment and you don't have assets that are helping cover that, they're making that payment for you. Bad use, right? And it's bad debt.
Yeah.
And that's what, really holds people back. And so this constant, need for the newest car is an interesting behavioral dynamic I've witnessed in people that's really caused a detriment, I think far greater than they realize, in the end. If you look at retirement savings and you say, okay, average cost of a vehicle today, let's call it $50,000. And, somebody on Main Street goes to retire with $1 million in their IRA or whatever, but have financed cars their whole life. Well, when you get to retirement, you now have to take money out of the IRA at, reasonable rate to pay the car loans, or you have to take $100,000 out of the IRAs to pay them off. Except it's worse than that. You got to pull out enough from the IRA to gross it up for the taxes. And so you could be anywhere from, needing to pull out $120,000 to $140,000 out of the IRA to pay off the two cars, and then immediately takes your retirement savings down 15%, right?
Yeah.
Just to have the cars, right? And so, being at a spot where if you're somebody that, again, you want to drive a nicer car, you want to buy a new car every couple of years, whatever, nothing wrong with that. But what does it really take to afford that is a different conversation. And you just want to understand the impacts it's going to have long-term. So, okay, so car is maybe like the point where you start to look and say, hey, do I start investing, or do I just aggressively pay the car off? I think you should think about risk capacity too. Like, what's your risk tolerance emotionally? Do you want the thing that's like a little bit more guaranteed, right? Because if you save money on interest, it's sort of a guaranteed return. If you, but you could take some risk and potentially make higher returns in financial markets, right? Investing in assets. So you got to look where that's at, where your risk threshold is. I generally think with cars, though, it's nothing wrong with the prudence of paying a car off,
Oh, correct. Definitely.
You know what I mean? Unless you're a little bit more sophisticated and really understand what you're kind of, doing with your whole balance sheet. I think that's a really great place to stop. But I think that kind of answers the question for most people, right? Like most people, once they get beyond the cars, it's kind of the same sequence from there, right? Like, okay, you get to the student loans, you want to pay student loans off. It kind of just starts to depend on the rate and your time horizon, your capacity for risk, what keeps you up at night versus doesn't. What are your end goals? Where do you want to be in retirement? So how fast do you need to grow money, right? Or, what's that capacity there, right? So I think getting to that stage helps people really clarify the way that they should be sort of thinking about it. Certainly, if anyone has more specific questions, they can reach out. What's the easiest way to get a hold of you, Marcus, if somebody wants to, pick your brain a little bit more on this kind of stuff?
So I have just Marcus at DWM on Instagram is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Okay, great. Well, easy peasy.
Yep.
Appreciate you and all the work you do. Just helping get people dialed in and stay on track, right? It's like that accountability piece is so important. I appreciate the effort you put in with that.
Yeah. Cool, man.
See everyone out there.